Well, thank you for having us. So I haven't seen you in a long time.
Since yesterday.
Yeah.
We had a board meeting yesterday.
Well, it's going to be similar to a board meeting. I get to ask all the questions that show my ignorance, and you get to be the brilliance and answer a bunch of the questions. So first question kind of alluded to this. How did you tell us about some defining moments in your life, especially in your childhood, that made you into an entrepreneur?
Mm-hmm. So my dad is an electrical engineer, and so growing up, he would always bring home stuff from work and kind of teach me to kind of question how do things work. And from that, I got a lot of curiosity, which is so important. And the second thing is he kind of taught me a can-do attitude. So he was always fixing things around the house, fixing the car, fixing the computer. And so he always taught me that if you put your mind to it, you can do really anything. At the age of 12, I picked up one of his books on the bookshelf, and it was basically DOS batch files. And so I started reading this book, and I started teaching myself how to script. And from there, I developed an interest, and I proceeded to buy all these books on programming, these 500-page books. I would just devour them. I'm like 12 at the time, 13, so I have a lot of spare time on my hands. And I basically taught myself how to program, and that was really the beginning of my entrepreneurial journey.
And then, when did you decide that you're gonna be a founder? Actually, like decide you're gonna start a company?
It wasn't necessarily a decision. I mean, my first kind of entrance into this, again, at a very young age. So I'm 12 years old, I'm teaching myself how to program. It's just a hobby. I'm putting my work on the internet. At the age of 14, somebody from the internet calls me. He says, I want to pay you $1,000 to write me a program. And so I told my dad, someone from the internet wants to pay me $1,000. And he just laughs. He's like, son, no one from the internet's going to pay you $1,000. But I said, I don't care. I'll just do it anyways for fun. And sure enough, 30 days later, I got paid $1,000. And so that was like me off to the races. And it was incredibly satisfying to get paid for something I already loved doing. And so very quickly, I got introductions to other people who needed similar things. And this was the beginning of a business that I ran throughout high school.
That's great. Now, a lot of people have heard the story about Airbnb and how it got started. It's a great story, so it's great to repeat it, but I want you to add something different and special that nobody's ever heard before.
This is actually a tough one because this story has been told so many times, and there's lots of fun facts that have gotten shared at one point or another. I think part of what was really fun during this period, and maybe doesn't get talked about so much, is how Joe, Brian, and I worked together as a team. You see, before all of this, we were roommates living together, and so we already had some familiarity with each other. Joe and Brian had gone to university together, so we had a certain bond, but we also had definitely our differences. They're designers, I'm engineers, we think about the world differently. It's a healthy tension. I think one of the first things was just like scoping the project, and how do we reduce this to something that can be done in just 3 weeks? And so the very first iteration of Airbnb only took 3 weeks. That's how reduced it was. At times as the scope grew, that introduced tension. Me being the only engineer, very quickly the amount of work kind of creeps up and puts stress on the relationship. One of the things we did to maintain the strength of our relationship, and during a period of Y Combinator where we ultimately were successful, was we started living together again. And not only living together, but being extremely regimented. So we'd wake up at 8 a.m. Every day, get right down to business, have breakfast, start working. In the evening, we would go to the gym together. Brian is very familiar with the gym, so he would basically personal train us. We'd cook dinner, go to bed by midnight, do it all again 6 to 7 days a week, even things like grocery shopping. And so literally, we had no personal time. We just did everything together. And that was actually really brought us closer together as a team.
How much could you bench at that time?
I could never really stick with it consistently because Brian would burn us out too quickly. Because he could just do anything. And he would just get a kick out of basically prescribing too much too soon.
So let's get back to a little bit more serious topic. I mean, you guys had this bond. It was obviously, you had some similar sort of values and some tension. How did you incorporate that into the Airbnb culture going forward? And as the company started to grow and expand, how did you make sure that the culture continued to be a great culture at Airbnb? Because it's obvious from the outside that Airbnb has a great culture.
I think first was recognizing that we had something special together. And so recognizing how our distinct backgrounds and the tension that that created was actually a good thing, that it led us to compromises that incorporated different points of view and better solutions. Before we ever hired our first employee, we came up with a set of core values, the things that we thought were important that we wanted to preserve amongst the three of us. And so we documented that before hiring anybody. We actually took a lot of inspiration from Zappos. So we went to Zappos, did the company tour, learned all about it. That's how we got familiar with Alfred, who was clearly leading Zappos at the time as COO and CFO. So one was just being really clear about the core values and like the vision that we had. And then as the company scaled, really just reiterating that, right? I mean, it's a question of how, not only defining it, but then practicing it and communicating it. And particularly as you scale, communication becomes probably one of the biggest enablers of the team. Just being really clear, what are we trying to do, and driving that in every week, every month.
And so how do you communicate? I mean, at a small scale, you can talk to everyone. You're in how many countries?
There's an inflection point. So when you can all sit around the same table, everything is super easy. You never even actually have to think about communicating, because everything that's happening, you hear and see yourself. But the minute you're sitting at different tables, it actually starts to get a lot tougher. And so at the point of about 8 people, you're probably now sitting at 2 tables, 10 people. And that's when things got a lot harder.
And you continue to invest in culture, right? Last week you had one Airbnb.
We have this thing called One Airbnb. We do it each year. This was actually the second year we've done it. We basically bring all our employees from around the world to San Francisco, a total of 1,500 people, half of which flew in from other places, oftentimes from other countries. Pretty big investment, but I mean, I can't even put into words what this event is like and the kind of energy it produces and the camaraderie. And I think at the end of the day, like, it's not necessarily about the idea, it's about the execution. And what's going to be the gating factor in the execution? The people. And so getting not only smart people, but people who gel together well and are equally committed and passionate is worth everything. And that's why we still make the effort, even at great scale and great cost, to do things like what was last week, which is One Airbnb.
So I think a lot of the audience would love to hear how you guys grew internationally. You guys make it look easy. It would be great to hear about some of the struggles that you had. You're in every single country except for 4?
Yeah, we are not in Syria, Iran, Iraq, Cuba. No, Iraq, North Korea.
North Korea.
Yeah, the ones we're not allowed to be in, we're not in.
But tell us about how Airbnb sort of scaled and it became an international powerhouse and the struggles of
I think most people are familiar with the fact that we focused on New York, and that's where we really, in the beginning, we focused on New York, and that's where we first kind of demonstrated success. And we figured out product market fit, and we began to grow. And very quickly, it's like, well, how can we prove that this works outside of New York? What are the other important markets? Well, there's really good third-party data for this. So we literally just downloaded a list of like the top 100 destinations in the world, like cities for tourism. And so very quickly, it was clear Paris is actually the number 1, not New York, London, et cetera, et cetera. So we made a list of these markets. And then we thought, well, what are the elements of New York? Like, what in New York is making this work? How do we replicate this in these new places? And some of the elements were things like, you need at least a couple hundred properties. We felt that we needed to photograph a large percentage of these properties. We knew that the reviews were important, so how do we make sure that they get their first booking, even if that first booking is us? So basically, you make a playbook with a series of steps. Another important part was hiring locals. So it's very easy to think that all places are similar, especially like when you're writing software. It's like, oh, I'm going to write this code, and it's going to be used around the globe, and it's not going to be any different code. But when you are doing something that touches real people and requires their cooperation, their mental buy-in, we found it was extremely helpful to have locals to help us get introduced to certain networks, influencers, get partnerships, explain why certain things are different. So that was an important part of the playbook as well. And today we have almost 20 offices globally in our key countries, staffed with locals who promote Airbnb in country.
So any plans to get into the last 4 countries that you're not in?
Not yet.
Okay, moving on. Lots of people talk about the sharing economy. One of the observations you guys have sort of made is that the sharing economy is about trust. When did you guys understand that? Was it really early on? And what did you do once you understood it to make sure that there's real trust that you can rely on when they come to Airbnb, when they use the platform?
So when we started out, people weren't using the term sharing economy or collaborative consumption. It doesn't mean that people didn't have like peer-to-peer commerce happening. I think it had kind of been forgotten about, and we brought a lot of attention to it and gave it buzz again. In the beginning, our key trust features was basically very rich profiles where you saw the picture of the person and everything about them. Handling the payments, because that was a source of a lot of mistrust, like, am I going to lose my money? And then third was the reviews, which is like this kind of like unbiased third-party perspective that this place is actually what it seems. So it was a very simple recipe, and over time we've built on that quite a bit. When I think about what we in the sharing economy is accomplishing, I think back to the days when people were afraid to use their credit card on the internet, or they were afraid to upload their real identity into Facebook and their pictures, et cetera. And I think there's a day in the future where the vast majority of people are suddenly much more trusting of others. In other words, there's a framework in which a whole new activity can take place that couldn't happen before. And I think that's what we're seeing today with the sharing economy.
So what do you think will happen with the sharing economy 5 to 10 years from today? We're in first innings of what's going on.
I just think that so many resources and so much utility could be unlocked. Think about what we could do together if we all trusted one another. Let's say like family, let's take it to the extreme. If everybody in this room, in this city, in the Bay Area, treated each other or had that level of comfort, just think of how much more we could get done as a society, whether it's sharing our houses or our cars, or just helping one another in different ways. And I think there's a lot of talk about how technology has the potential to eliminate a lot of jobs, but I also think that if we can overcome trust, if we could all trust one another and find ways of collaborating better together, we could basically create whole new industries or greatly enlarge 10x, 100x kind of activities that basically were obscure before.
Yeah, that's good food for thought. What do you do for fun?
Airbnb. What do I do for fun?
You have a new boss, right?
I just had a daughter, so she's 4 months old. So that's my latest fun project.
What has she been teaching you?
What is she teaching me? It's a reminder of how much satisfaction you get out of a strong sense of purpose. And so with Airbnb, and with building anything in general, you have a strong sense of purpose and pride in something that you create. And it's no different, I think, with your own child. And so it's been really rewarding to invest a huge amount of effort, but then kind of understand and see that progression every single day. It's no different than a company and looking at the metrics, seeing her evolve.
So who do you think is your first child? Your daughter or Airbnb?
Now we're getting the real tough questions. Well, are you doing chronologically or in terms of importance?
No, getting back more seriously, on international, do you want to share some metrics on how big you are internationally versus the US, just so people know scale-wise?
Yeah, most people probably imagine us being pretty international, but maybe the numbers will surprise you. So more than half of our business is in Europe. So more than half of the revenue comes from Europe. More than 2/3 of the properties are in Europe. And then Asia is the fastest growing region. So the US is quickly becoming a smaller and smaller minority of the business. And again, we're in 190 different countries. We are the leader of this category in each of those countries. So pretty remarkable for 7 years.
Airbnb has the vision of making everyone belong anywhere. And so that's pretty grand and pretty big. What can we expect to see in the coming years? You mentioned a little bit about expanding more in Asia, but what other things will Airbnb be doing in the coming years to fulfill that vision?
So certainly a focus has been opening up different geographies, and I don't want to say we've maxed that out, but like we're present everywhere, and we need to build our depth most everywhere as well. But that's a story you're all familiar with. I think some other dimensions would include different travel use cases. So not just being about leisure, just being about more affordable, just being about short term, but the opposite of each of those. So maybe we can do something around business travel, for example. Another dimension, I think, is how can we leverage the other assets that we have? So in other words, with our scale, huge number of travelers using Airbnb at any given time in any given city. We also know a huge number of locals who are highly engaged with our product. How can we make some magic happen? How can we connect people to create more meaningful experiences? And with everybody having mobile in their pocket, how can we deliver value throughout the entirety of the trip? I think this is a huge opportunity for us and something that we're only really just starting in on.
If you were able to travel back in time to when you guys started, and you had to give yourself one bit of advice, what would that piece of advice be?
Good question. I think just reassurance, right? And we had a lot of reassurance. We had mentors, and they said, what you're going through is totally the normal journey, and in retrospect, it totally is the normal journey, which is that the first year, don't expect anything to work, and it goes from tough to worse, and you're going to have a lot of moments where the team feels like it's falling apart, and you want to quit, and there's a shinier opportunity over to your right. So I think just recognizing that is normal, and then also realizing that nothing gets done without complete focus. And that was something we didn't realize until a whole year in. It wasn't until Y Combinator, 1 year after we started, that we went through that regimen I described earlier, where we wake up at 8 a.m., go to bed at midnight, do everything together. And it was only then when we were focused 110% that we really started to get traction. And I do credit our success to that mentality, which we didn't have for an entire year.
So at this point, Airbnb is really successful. We would all love to be part of another Airbnb, be part of Airbnb or another Airbnb. At this point, what drives you?
I think it's the same thing when I began, whether I was 12 or 7 years ago when we started Airbnb. It's at my core, I'm an engineer. I think I got that from my father. I like to understand how things work. I like to build. So anything that involves building, optimizing, and really understanding how things work excites me. And fast forward to today, where Airbnb is, it's never been a better time. There's never been so much potential to have impact doing that kind of work than I have right now at Airbnb. And so that's what excites me. But it kind of is the same thing that excited me 7 years ago or 20 years ago. And I think that's probably true for a lot of engineers. It's just awesome to build something, see people use it, and in effect, you get back a sense of strong purpose.
Well, great, Nate. Thank you very much for sharing all of your wisdom, and thanks for all the inspiration. It's really been fun.
Yeah, thanks, Alfred. Thank you for listening.